Hello, I'm Paula James, and I'm joined by Anastasia Bakogianni and Tony Keane. And this is our second discussion, actually looking at the broader remit of reception and some of the exciting challenges it presents to those of us who are teaching reception and indeed researching in it. We shall also go on to talk about the dramatising of Troy and the dramatising of Rome, which is the background to Seneca, Nero's Rome in particular. So I'm going to hand over to Tony now, because he stands up in front of his students every year and explains a little bit about reception to them when he's teaching on the myth module.
Thank you, Paula. The key to the idea of reception is that you cannot approach any text as virgin territory. You are always going to be influenced by other people who have written or who have approached in some way these texts that you are looking at. Even those texts that you yourself have not actually read, those other people's views that you yourself have not fully consciously aware of, because they have all slipped out into the zeitgeist and they're all around there and shaping our opinions all the time in ways that we don't always understand and in ways that sometimes we don't acknowledge. And what reception history is really about is acknowledging that. And the great theorist for reception in classical studies is Charles Martindale, Professor Emeritus at the University of Bristol, who in 1992 published a book called Redeeming the Text, which was applying reception theory to classical texts in a way that had not been done before, because up until the 1990s, classicists, frankly, were very resistant to any sort of theory, and many of them still are. But Martindale produced this work, and he spun off almost an industry in classical reception coming from that book, although very often the people who've come in to do classical reception after Martindale aren't necessarily doing it in the ways in which he was laying out in that book. They often have different approaches that they've taken in ways that I think Martindale probably wouldn't necessarily approve of. One of the things that Martindale is notorious for saying is that how disappointed he was that more people were studying Gladiator as a piece of reception than were studying Dante's reception of Virgil.
And I suppose the other thing that intrigues me about Martindale's concerns is that he doesn't really seem to see that if you study Gladiator properly, comprehensively in a university, you have to think about not only the kind of movies that influenced it, so a bit of film history, which is a rigorous study. You also have to think about all kinds of artworks and literature and probably the kind of canonical texts that Martindale does approve of, which have filtered in to that particular movie. So it isn't just a question of studying a film and then maybe looking back at the history of the period it's portraying and saying, oh, that doesn't seem to be very accurate, or, oh, that's an interesting way of thinking of the ambience in Rome at the time. So I think he misses a trick, personally, if he's concerned about studying a movie rather than Dante, I think, is the example he gives.
To attempt to use reception to assert a new canon misses one of the great things about reception, which is its ability to democratise the subject. And the reason why I think Martindale is wrong to dismiss Gladiator as not being important is because Gladiator, for a long time, was the way in which most people in the population encountered the Roman world. And I think as classicists, we need to follow people's perceptions of the ancient world as classicists working reception studies. And we can't only be interested in the perceptions of posh people who've got classics degrees. We have to also to look at everybody.
I suppose we have to say too with popular texts, even if we feel that they're not particularly worthy or don't succeed very well as movies, which is the way one has to judge them, of course. The other interesting thing is they sometimes somehow kind of hit the right note, I feel, for those of us who are more familiar with the classical history or with Latin and Greek. They, as I said before, they capture a kind of ambience, or they identify a trend, a real historical trend, even if the events they depict they've actually created and made up for the screen. So I think you make the point, Tony, that where Martindale is perhaps not really he's not seeing the cultural significance of Gladiator, he's worrying about its aesthetic value.
Mm. Another very important classical reception theorist is Emeritus Professor Lorna Hardwick at the Open University. And one of the interesting things that she talks about is how we can use the modern reception to also try to go back to the ancient text. Granted, this attempt might not always be a very successful one, but I think she's right when she advocates that we should at least try to do that. And that's actually one of the guiding principles of this block, that we are trying to return to an original through reception. Now, of course, that attempt will ultimately fail, but it's the process of trying to get back, of trying to engage the ancient in dialogue with the modern that is important here.
But I think also, if I can just say that when it's putting Roman historical periods on film, it is interesting to go back and look at the way the ancient historians themselves liked to dramatise their more recent past and see it in terms of theatre and spectacle, and use those kind of metaphors, which Tacitus certainly does about the reign of Nero. So we're forced to look back at what we know of the ancient world from the historians, but not just from the literary point of view.
For many people, watching Gladiator will illuminate the classical world in ways in which it might not for a professor of ancient history or a professor of Latin literature. And I think there are some very fine moments in Gladiator, hollow though I feel its basic plot is. But the procession of Commodus into the Forum, Ridley Scott has not constructed anything that actually looks like the ancient Forum, but he really conveys the claustrophobic atmosphere of being overshadowed by all the buildings that are in the Roman Forum of the imperial era. And this is something I regularly show to my students to convey that atmosphere.
I would agree, and also the fear of the arena. When you emerge from up into the arena and you don't know what to expect, what way of death are you going to suffer? Which brings us back to this whole spectacle of suffering and trying to engage with the way both the spectators feel and those who are being watched and are about to die.
Indeed, and to go back to ancient Greek spectacles of violence and to bring in Wolf Petersen's 2004 movie Troy, inspired by Homer, as the credits say. There are a lot of spectacles of violence in that movie, and spectacle is I think, foregrounded. I love that scene where the Greek army lands on Troy, and then like locusts, they descend on the Trojan plain and start to commit violent acts. And that often reminds me of the Homeric text, that passage in which the Greek army is like a fire that's seen from the distance, and it's also very destructive, of course, which I mention in the earlier part of the study material.
Yes, it's very clear that David Benioff, who wrote the screenplay for Troy, he has read the Iliad, he is familiar with Homer. It's actually quite surprising how much of Homer's metaphors and how much of his typical passages actually get into the movie. You've got that fetishistic arming process that we find in in the Iliad, regularly those genre passages of putting the armour on come up. And you find that in Peterson's Troy. You see it immediately before the fight between Achilles and Hector, where you see both Achilles and Hector putting on their armour. And also the scene where Priam comes to Achilles to beg for the return of the body of the decked Hector. That scene is littered with quotations from Homer's version of that scene. I think it's, in that respect, very interesting.
I agree. I think the film succeeds visually in some respects more than it does in terms of narrative.
I would agree there are some very visually arresting moments in the film Troy. And I think Martin Winkler, in the 2007 edited essays on the film Troy, actually points out that swift-footed Achilles, something that really characterises him, one of his heroic attributes, is really beautifully portrayed in the first killing of Achilles actually carries out in the movie, because you get that sense of speed. And also there is some sense of Achilles as quite a conflicted hero, although the kind of dilemmas and ethical moral dilemmas that the movie gives him are not going to be the same as the ones that Homer hints at in the Iliad.
So, Paula, you've mentioned Martin Winkler there, who's one of the most important people writing on classical reception in film at the moment. He's been responsible for some very important collections, not just on Troy, but also on Gladiator, on Stanley Kubrick's 1961 movie Spartacus, and on Michael Mann's 1964 movie Fall of the Roman Empire. I personally think Winkler has done a very good job in bringing together these volumes, but I do have some problems with his theoretical approaches, which he outlines in most detail in a book called Cinema and Classical Texts.
Apollo's New Light.
Apollo's New Light. He talks about film philology there, and he talks about movies as if you can just come in and deconstruct them in the same way that you would take apart a Greek or Roman text, which is a very traditional way of doing things. It goes back to this assumption that I mentioned earlier, that once you've mastered Greek and Roman philology, you can do anything, which I think I personally find that problematic. I think actually film studies is more complicated and more different than Winkler actually allows. And I also have issues with his introduction to the book on Troy, because he talks about Wolfgang Petersen as if his entire career was directed towards making this movie Troy. And I don't think such a sort of teleological approach, such an approach that assumes that the end product means that that's where you were always heading in the first place, I don't think that is terribly helpful, particularly in something like a Hollywood movie, which is affected by so many strange processes in its production.
I suppose, to be fair to Winkler, he does include an interesting essay in this edited collection on Troy by John Solomon. And Solomon is quite concerned to talk about who is watching the film and why the film was made, the whole entertainment industry, mutual manipulation between audiences and movie makers. So he does include those kind of approaches, but I do agree with you. I worry that in some ways he is, although he's very much opposed to Martindale, who doesn't want us studying popular movies, doesn't want us giving these to our students as texts, although he's opposed to Martindale, he ends up in the same kind of elitist position, ironically, in saying, but it's only really classicists who can explain what's going on in a movie. And he does tend to see, I think, classical resonance as when it's just kind of a cultural mnemonic that's going on. And I've done this myself, so I'm pleading guilty. But I do think that's one of the interesting things about Winkler. He's highly imaginative and he knows his film theory and he can bring out all the terms. He understands about cinematic composition. So like people like Maria Wijk, he certainly studied cinema. So he's very important and very skilled from that point of view. But I think people in media studies and in film history studies would be quite annoyed to hear that only really classicists can analyse some of these big blockbuster movies and other films, indeed.
Well, to come to Martin Winkler's defence, I agree that there are problems with his approach, but also going back to the point that Tony made about engaging with these films because they are part of how the ancient world is perceived today. We as classicists and those who are studying the classics, I think, have to, in certain ways, look at these as text, so apply some of the philological methodology that we have taught you how to do in this module. So see them as text, but always bearing in mind that this isn't a straightforward case and there are no real answers. And perhaps this is a good point to mention that interdisciplinary collaboration is really, really important in classical reception because we, or any one of us, no matter how brilliant, can never hope to cover absolutely everything. But that's actually the whole point about reception. It is very much about how we view the classics and becoming more self-aware of this process and trying to be as honest about it as we can be. Of course, there's always limitations to that. But as I mentioned before, I think the process of trying to mediate and go back to the past and mediate that through the present is in itself an important, if at times not possible. Not entirely possible, perhaps.
But I hope students will enjoy reading even just small sections of scholars like Martin Winkler and Maria Wijk, who, of course, is extremely important for her book, Projecting the Past, because she's actually contextualising films dealing in the portrayal of Rome on screen and looking at all the contemporary concerns, but also looking at their place in cinematic history. So she's very much a big figure in this. But also, one has to be fair, the kind of contributions that Charles Martindale has made. So we are going to give some kind of sense of what all of these scholars have said and how they've engaged with the reception of Rome and the reception, indeed, of Troy on screen.
I think the very best research that's done in reception is often done by people who think of themselves not just as classicists. I mean, I certainly, in my research, which is primarily on reception in modern science fiction, I absolutely think of myself as a classicist, but I also absolutely think of myself as a science fiction critic. And it's bringing the two together that is the ideal for the very best work that's done in reception. The very best people who write on classics and Shakespeare are not just classicists, they're also Shakespearean scholars.
Indeed. So perhaps we should rephrase that and say it's people with classical reception interests, whichever department they may happen to belong to, or whichever department they might aspire to belong to in the future.
Which is, of course, why classical reception is such hard work.
Indeed.
That seems a very neat point to end our discussion upon. I think all three of us know as classicists that we've always had to be rather interdisciplinary because we're studying the ancient world from all kinds of perspectives, art history, archaeology, from the language, looking closely at the texts, and also philosophy. In fact, all kinds of disciplines come into studying classics. And really all we're doing in reception is trying to apply those to the way the modern world is receiving films and plays about Greece and Rome today. So I'm going to say farewell and pass over to Anastasia.
Goodbye, and we hope that you find this discussion useful.
And Tony.
Thank you for listening.